Now, I sort of was giving sort of negative advertising this morning about this session. I'm a little concerned about it. I noticed my lovely picture there, criticism of the Old Testament, or getting into the weeds, deep into the weeds is what I put as a sort of a subheading. Now, why do we want to talk about criticism of the Old Testament? Well, it is something, as I was anticipating going through this, I was working through, again, through my notes from when I took this class, my wife's notes when I took this class back in university, and there's part of the introductory material about the Old Testament has to do with criticism of, basically, it comes from unbelieving liberal Bible scholars. So you say, well, why do I need to know this? And I'm not certain that you absolutely need to know it. I'm also not certain you need to know as much as I'm going to tell you. Okay? It's one of those things because I've read a lot about it and there's a lot of material, and we're just going to survey. We're not even going to get into it too deep. At least I don't think it's too deep. But it is you will hear things like this when people talk about the Bible, like on the radio. I guess nobody listens to the radio anymore, but you're some kind of broadcast or podcast or something. I listen to a lot of history podcasts. I was listening to somebody just this week who was talking about the history of Muhammad. So that was very interesting. But in there, of course, it touches on the Bible. And the guy who was speaking was I don't know, he might say he was a Christian. I don't think he was. But he said things about the Bible, they're just not true. And so you'll hear things like this, or maybe you're reading a book, and it may, supposedly a Christian book, but they will give some kind of concession to some of these ideas. So my reason for telling you about them is so that you can understand, or you can know a little bit. And in the back of your mind, you can have there, oh yeah, I've heard about these kinds of things before. And that's number one. And number two, and I've heard that there's good rational answers for these kinds of things. So that's my reason. We will have a little bit of Bible in today's session, but it's going to be mostly just a lecture giving you facts. And so as I said, I'm sort of reluctant in a way to talk about it, but at the same time, I think it's important as we study the Bible to know what the critics say about the Bible. So that's my purpose in doing this. So first, before we get into that, there are two fundamental Christian presuppositions that underline everything we believe. Number one, God exists. There is a God. That's where we start. And number two, God has spoken. So and I should say, God has spoken in the Bible. It's just not anywhere. I mean, obviously, He's spoken through creation as well. But it is especially that God has spoken in the Bible. And I have a comment. I read this one to you a few weeks ago. This is from Eugene Merrill. He says, in short, it is safe to say without hesitation that we possess the originals insofar as they were faithfully preserved by godly and exacting scribes down through the ages. It is not overstating the case to say that we possess the Old Testament of the prophets. So we are saying that the God who is the one who spoke in the Old Testament. That's the presupposition that we're operating on. We can't exactly necessarily prove those statements in a sense that maybe somebody is going to demand scientific proof. But as we understand the Bible, we understand that the Bible claims to be the voice of God, and then we see the effects of believing in the Bible, and we see that the Bible is true. Okay, so that's our rationale. It's not just blind faith, but it's a faith in testimony and in the testimony of the Bible and the testimony of Christians, I guess is how we support our presuppositions. Any comments or questions on that first very basic point? Marilyn. Josephus does back up some of the statements in the Bible, but there's a lot of things about Josephus that we have to be careful with because he has his own biases, and he makes mistakes, and so which we can see in other places. So, and yeah, well, that's part of the bias. He was catering to the Romans because he was a Jew who switched sides, and fought against his own people. So he was catering to the Romans, and so his things are. I mean, it's true enough, but it's not. And it's a reference work, but and it can be used as sort of the background of the Bible, but it's not a proof for sure. Okay. Anything else that anybody else want to ask, or let's move on? I am also aware of time. So, understanding criticism. What do we mean by criticism? So, first, a definition. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary. These are the first two definitions. If you're on their site, or if you have access to their site, this is what they say. Number one, the art or practice of analyzing, evaluating, and commenting on the qualities and character of something, especially literary texts or other creative works, or later, more generally, restaurants, wine, food, etc. The work of a critic. That's what criticism is. So you have heard of a restaurant critic, like some big newspapers will have a restaurant critic that goes around and has a meal at the restaurant and then writes it up, and hopefully it's good for the restaurant. Okay, and there's movie critics and so forth, so that's just the idea of criticism in general. So especially then, the scholarly investigation of literary or historical texts, especially the Old and New Testaments, with regard to their origin, authenticity, and composition. So this is definition number 1 and definition number 1A under the word criticism. So when we talk about criticism, it's not just that somebody said something mean to somebody else. Okay? This word, its primary meaning is the activity of analyzing and decoding the quality and character of something, especially something that's written, and in this case, especially the Bible. So when we say criticism, it's not a negative word. It has that connotation in our minds, but it's not just a negative word. All right, so then types of criticism. There's, first of all, lower or textual criticism, which concerns the identification of the words of the Bible. It is a most welcome discipline to those who believe in the verbal and plenary inspiration of the Scriptures. So textual criticism is where you take an ancient manuscript, a copy of the Bible, and you compare it to another manuscript with the same text, and you look for differences. And as, of course, they're hand-copied, there almost always are at least some minor differences. So lower criticism, or textual criticism, looks at those differences, analyzes where the documents came from, how old they were, which one came first, why that difference might exist. Sometimes it's just a matter of transposing letters, and that is that happens all the time. That's not a critical mistake, and so the critic can look at that and dismiss that difference. But sometimes there's bigger differences, and so then they have to really work and think about which represents the original reading. That's lower criticism. Okay, and then higher criticism involves issues of authorship, integrity, date, content, and style of the individual books of the Bible. These are matters of interest to conservatives, as each of these issues contribute to a more precise understanding of the books. That's what Barrett is saying. So that is, in that sense, it's not that we want to say that lower criticism is good and higher criticism is bad. Both types of criticism are good. When we're talking about higher criticism, usually when I introduce a book to you, we start teaching a book or preaching in a book, I do a few Bible studies that are introductions to that book. We'll talk about date, we'll talk about author, we'll talk about place of writing, talk about the reason they wrote. That's higher criticism. Okay, we're looking at those factors, the little things that tell us. So for instance, I keep talking about Hebrews. I keep mentioning the background where it's written to Hebrew Christians who are being, we think, being persecuted for their Christian faith. All right, so that's higher criticism. We derive that notion by this process that's called higher criticism. Does that make sense? All right, I'm going to give you two more words and then I'll give you a chance to respond to this. So, lower criticism, questions about the transmission of the text or of the Bible. Higher criticism, questions about the origin of the Bible. Where did it come from? Why was it written? Who wrote it? Okay, does that make sense? Any comments or questions so far? Now this is highly, okay, Bridget, go ahead.
The Bible comes from historical facts. And we talk about higher criticism. Can we say that it falls under that or it has another category?
Right. Okay, so she says a lot of the criticism she's seen of the Bible has to do with historical facts, or at least allegations that the Bible is incorrect historically, right? And yes, that falls under higher criticism. Okay, because what we want to do when we're talking about here, notice that word involves issues of authorship integrity. So in criticizing the Bible, critiquing the Bible, analyzing the Bible, we want to make certain that what it is saying has integrity. Now, the one thing, I'm not going to get into it too deeply right now, but when there have been historical challenges to the Bible, the thing that has happened historically is the challenge is raised, and the liberals say, see, here Daniel made a mistake, or see, here whoever, they made a mistake. Well then, lo and behold, an archaeologist digs up the mistake, and it proves it wasn't a mistake. Okay, so that has sort of brought the higher critics up short, but they keep on criticizing anyway. Okay.
So to summarize what you're saying then, would you be saying that at times, like, because archaeology is a newer study, like maybe 150 years old, where people are digging up stuff,
Yeah.
that as things have been dug up, they have proven where people say that the Bible is wrong?
Well, there have been instances of that. So here's the thing, is that archaeology, you never know what you're going to find. And you never know where to dig. And sometimes there's a city on top of where you want to dig, and it's not really easy to dig there. So, but the thing is that, all I'm saying is that not every time. There are still things where liberals will criticize the Bible for historic, so-called inaccuracies. But the point I'm making is that in the past, that has often been refuted by later discoveries. Right, James?
And just like on the opposite side of that, there's been some wonderful biblical commentaries and books talking about the archaeological sign.
Yeah.
You know, saying like these towns have been found in places where only the Bible said they were.
Yeah,
and that
that's
sort
right.
of stuff. You know?
That's right. So there are a lot of things like that. Let's not get off too much on that. We're just trying to understand what criticism is at this point. All right, so this is the next statement Barrett makes. But, okay, most higher critics deny the supernatural inspiration and immediate consequent canonicity of the books of the Bible and contend that the Bible is of human origin. So he is describing, notice he says, most higher critics. Now, as a conservative Bible teacher, Bible believer, I want to say that when I look at those factors about the Bible, integrity, authorship, date, origin, my presupposition is that God exists, and God has spoken. And so God hasn't made a mistake. When God speaks, he doesn't make a mistake. Right? So, my presupposition towards the Bible is there's not a problem with the Bible. The problem is with the critic. Okay, now notice how he's describing these higher critics. He says they deny the supernatural inspiration and the immediate consequent canonicity, in other words, authority of the books of the Bible. So what is their presupposition? Well, they might believe there's a God, but they don't believe he has spoken directly through the Bible. Okay? And so that's where the issue is. They have a false presupposition, which leads to their false conclusions. But we're just talking about understanding what criticism is. So here's some key suppositions of liberal higher criticism. The canon, so the rule of acceptance of the Old Testament, came late, allowing for gradual development of the text. What that means is, what they will say, not only were the books written many years after the events, but the Jews didn't settle on which ones were authoritative until in the 500s BC. Okay? Or the 400s even, some of them. So, in other words, Isaiah didn't have, they would say, Isaiah didn't have the first 5 books of Moses. Okay, that's what the liberal critics are going to say. They might have had parts of it, but not all of it. Okay? So, then, secondly, reason becomes the measure of truth. So, everything is tested by reason. It's not tested by the Bible. So, human reason. Number 3, any differences in the text, stylistic, vocabulary, duplication, is evidence of problems the editors, and the word they use for that is redactors. And I'm just going to mention that. It's like, why do I need to know this word? Well, you don't have to memorize it. I'm just saying it so that it's stuck in your brain somewhere. If you ever see that written down or somebody uses it, you'll know sort of what it's talking about. Editors of the Old Testament tried to harmonize at the point of canonization. So I'll give you an example. We're going to hit this example again later on. So there's often, frequently said, there are 2 records of creation in Genesis. How many of you have ever heard that statement? Okay. They will say Genesis 1 is one record, Genesis 2 is a different record. And there are variations between them that proves they come from what? Different sources. That's higher criticism. And so, in fact, according to the way the higher critics say, chapter 1, the tradition behind it was actually written down during the time of Solomon. And chapter 2 wasn't written down for another 300 years. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. So that's an attack on the integrity of the text. And so they're saying, well, there's a difference in style, there's a difference in vocabulary between these 2 chapters. That proves that they have a different source. Now, we'll get to this a little later, but is it possible that a writer can have more than one name that they use for God? Well, of course. Okay, but because these people come with a presupposition that the Bible is wrong and is not inspired, therefore any differences show, aha, see, there we go, there's a mistake. Okay, that's what they're saying. All right. That's their main presuppositions. Okay, I guess I should pause and let you ask a question. Anybody want to ask a question about their presuppositions? You want me to move on? I'm running out of time, so I'm a little afraid of this too. Yes. Oh, I thought I saw a hand. Okay, anybody else? Okay, let's move on now. Okay, the history of higher criticism. This is sort of, in the beginning was Darwin. Okay, now that's not quite exactly accurate, but I added an extra weed to our screen here. So Darwin, the origin of the species. What his work did is promote the theory of evolution, and theory of evolution was quickly applied to every field of human studies. So they assumed that intellectual life progressed gradually upward from primitive life forms to humanoid species to primitive man to cognitive man. There's probably a few extra ones in between. And so they talk about the evolution of religion also. Okay? So there's a Darwinian approach to religion. Does that make sense? So here's my list. Oh, I got to put this on your screen. So animism. So this is primitive man, and they hear the thunder. Oh, there's a spirit there. They see there's an earthquake. Oh, the ground has a spirit. Okay, that's animism. Okay, And then comes polydaimonism. There's many spirits. Okay, the spirit of the wind, the spirit of the... Get what I'm saying, right? Many spirits. Okay? Okay, then comes polytheism. They elevate them. Now there's many gods. The Romans were polytheists. They had many gods. And very interesting to think of how the civilization they developed, even though they're polytheist. Okay? And then comes monolatry. So there's many gods, but the worship of one. Okay, so you see some references to different names of false gods in the Old Testament. So Chemosh was, is that Moab? I think that's Moab. And then the Ammonites had a different god, basically the same god, a different name. Okay? And then you'll see different regional names for different types of gods in the Old Testament. And in fact, I talked about this last week when the Assyrians peopled, or maybe that was Wednesday night, when the Assyrians sent people, colonists into the northern kingdom of Israel, and things weren't going so well. And so they decided, the God of that land is causing us trouble. Let's send some of those Israelites back so they can straighten things out and teach us the right religion for that land. So that's monolatry. Okay, so they believe there's many gods, but that each tribe or each group or each area has its own particular one God. Okay? Then comes monotheism, so the belief in one God. That's an elevation out of all of this. This is evolutionary. And of course, the evolutionists then say secularism. There is no God. They've finally evolved completely. Okay? Okay, that's basically the process, the way they look at it. Okay, now here's where I'm going to bring in the Bible. The Bible teaches devolution. Okay, so Romans 1, 20 to 23. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. So, here's the devolution. God was known at creation. Adam knew God. He told his sons about God. Noah knew God. He told his sons about God. They told their sons about God, but they quickly fell into idolatry, didn't they? Okay? Man rebelled against God. Okay? And then man exchanged the glory of God to that which is not God. And so there's various degradations of religion, from monolatry to polytheism to polydaimonism to animism. So, and secularism is its own idolatrous departure from God. It has made man God, essentially. So what we're saying is that there is, rather than the evolutionary view of religion, the Bible teaches, and correctly teaches, that there is a devolutionary view of religion. There is a true religion that worships the one God, but when people devolve from that, they turn away from God, and their religion becomes more and more superstitious, foolish, and darkened. All right? Yes, Maureen?
I find it interesting that the basis of all of this thought of, Darwin introducing this idea, over time, it's become clearer and clearer that even evolutionists recognize that his book was wrong.
Right.
Because simple life forms don't exist. Every simple life form is complex.
That's right, yeah.
And that so the beauty and the mystery of creation is, the more it's studied, the more people see the complexity of God.
That's right. That's right. So we see that the Darwinian ideas in science are being refuted, and people are just saying this isn't working. It's not possible.
And that's very unknown, because people believe it.
Well, the textbooks are behind the times.
Yeah.
A lot of times that's because people are still taught in textbooks. The textbooks in your high schools, your kids are reading, are behind the times. They were published whatever year, Okay, 5 years ago, they're already out of date. Okay, scientists have discovered things. Oh, well, maybe that one wasn't exactly true. When they teach us things about the Big Bang, they don't even believe that anymore. Okay? Stuff like that is just not even true. Now, let's not get off onto this. I do want to go off onto this, so make sure, because I know, Wolf, this is your hot button topic, so go ahead.
I just, on the previous screen, I found it interesting how the term, the root word for polydemonism is demon.
Yes, that is, yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know if that was coincidence or someone made it.
No, it's the same root, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on here. I want to move on. I thought you were going to go off on our creation stuff. That's cool. It's okay, Wolf. I know it's a good topic, but we're not talking about that one today. And I thought, oh no, Wolf's going to get me going. Okay. So let's trace out the timeline here of higher criticism. Now this goes back before Darwin. Okay, and so Darwin's theories gave impetus to some of the unbelieving ideas that were percolating around in biblical scholarship beforehand. Okay, so first of all, a guy named Jean Astruc, he was a physician in France, and he's the guy that I think is credited usually as the one who produced this notion that the different use of God's name in Genesis 1 and 2, the creation accounts, mean they came from different sources. So in chapter 1, it's primarily Elohim. I think that's right. Is that right? Let me think now. Or is it the other way around? No, it's Yahweh. It's Yahweh in chapter 1, because that's a J chapter. Okay? And in chapter 2, it's Elohim. Now, you'll find both names, I think, in both chapters. But there's predominantly one name in one chapter and predominantly the other name in the other chapter. So, Astruc says, oh, two different sources. Okay? So that was in 1758. And so then, 1780 to 1783, a man named Johann Eichhorn added some details. So the account that used Yahweh, Jehovah, became the J document. And the account that used Elohim became the E document. All right? Originally, this guy accepted that Moses was the author, or at least the editor of these documents. But in the end, he rejected Moses and proposed an unnamed redactor. Okay? So that's the idea he added in. He says, well, there were two sources, but it wasn't Moses who put this all together. It was some other guy later, and we'll call him the redactor. Okay? That's what he's saying. All right? Now, that's step number 2. Now, step number 3. The search for sources for the Pentateuch increased. Scholars proposed as many as 40 different sources used by the redactor, and then I put in brackets, redactors. In other words, they're even saying, well, it doesn't have to be one editor. It doesn't have to be one redactor. There could be a whole bunch of guys doing this, okay, over time. All right, so then the redactors worked mostly in the reign of Solomon, almost 500 years after Moses, if Moses existed at all. Okay, that's the critic's view. It's not mine. I want to make that clear. Okay, they identified a separate source for most of Deuteronomy, so that became the D document. And then they eventually the scholars said the priestly material, so the sacrifices, Leviticus, they were from the P source, the priestly source. So you have the Yahwists, the Elohists, this is what they called them, the Deuteronomists, and the priests. I'm not sure what the ists is for that. It starts with P anyway. All right. So then, all right, so that's that part of the timeline. Let's keep on going. The big name in this is after Darwin, is Julius Wellhausen, another German scholar. A lot of these guys a lot of this came from Germany, I have to say, in the German universities. All right, so establish a theoretical timeline for the 4 main source documents. So basically they're saying these are the main sources, even though they think there's many others. All right, so J is 900 to 450 BC as they're gathering the J documents together. So 900 is roughly the time of Solomon. The E, 750 to 700 BC, that's about the time of Isaiah. Okay, then the D, 621 BC. Okay? So those documents didn't even exist in written form according to them until, I guess, that would be around in the time of Josiah and Jeremiah. And then the P is after 586 BC, after the destruction of Jerusalem, and sometime when they came back, then the priests started putting together all the sacrifices and all that. Okay, that's what they're saying. Now, you look at, Maureen's got a very quizzical look on her face. I'm just telling you, this is what they say. Okay, this is what they're, and you think about this. Now, we believe, and they were focusing on the first 5 books of the Bible, we believe, as correctly, I believe, from what the Bible says, that Moses wrote down these words. Okay? Or God spoke them to Moses and he wrote them down. Or Moses spoke the words and maybe Joshua wrote what Moses was saying, so especially Deuteronomy. Okay? At the time that Moses lived, these things were done. The books were already in existence in 1446 BC, roughly, the date of the Exodus. So you see what they're doing. They're pushing these books. Part of them are maybe 500 years old. Part of them are 1,000 years old before they're even considered a part of the written record of Israel. You see what we're saying? So that's very damaging to the integrity of the Old Testament, if you believe this. All right. Sometime around 400 BC, the redactors, again I put an S there, put the whole lot together into the current form. So that's about the time of Malachi. Okay? If you're taking the Bible literally and taking the dates of, literally, but even then, these guys are going to say, haven't included this, they're going to say part of Daniel isn't even written yet. Why? Because he was so accurate in his prophecies. Okay? So, here's what Barrett says. The theory leaves no place, when we're talking about the Pentateuch, for Mosaic authorship or divine inspiration. You see, let's go back to our beginning presupposition. God is God. God really exists. And God has spoken. Now, if God can speak, he is always going to speak accurately. If there is a God, he's going to speak accurately. And if he uses men to speak as he says he did, then those men speaking for him will speak accurately. How big is God? Okay? I remember years ago when I was in real estate, I had an office mate. He was a great guy. I liked him a lot. But he was not a believer. He was raised going to church. He knew the Sunday school stories. I remember him saying one time to me, how could there be a fish so big it could swallow a man? I thought, how big is God? You see, that's the difference. The rationalist mind says, that can't possibly be. I said, well, how big is God? You have a very small idea of who God is if you think God can't do whatever he wants to do. You see? That's the issue, really, what it comes down to. Are you going to believe God or not? That's what it really comes down to. All right. Well, we're doing okay. I think we can finish. Okay, so modern criticism is my next one. And so number one, Barrett again. Critics have left the methodology. Now, okay, I've given you that history of all that documentary theory. Now, that was around 1900, that was the cutting edge of liberal theological research. Now, we're 125, what year is this? 125 years since 1900, right? So, the liberals don't stay still, they keep going. So, they actually don't use the documentary methods anymore. I'm talking about textbooks being out of date, right? I actually wrote to Dr. Barrett because he just published this book. And he was my advisor when I was in graduate school. So I wrote to him, I said, so where are they at now? I says, I've got this older book and it talks about this documentary theory. He says, where are they at now? He says, when you get my book, you'll see. And so this is what we're seeing. He says, they have left the methodology but have kept the conclusions as fact. They still say there were documents, JEDP. Yahwists, Elohists, Deuteronomists, and priests. Okay? They still keep those as the sources of the Pentateuch, but they have left the old methodology. They now have his dating system is no longer critical to Wellhausen's dating system, no longer critical to the theory, and some allow for older dating for the sources. So some very generous liberal scholars actually say, well, actually, it was written fairly in an old ancient time. It didn't have to go back so far as Wellhausen said. Okay, so they allow for maybe it to be written at the time of Solomon, or maybe at the time of, well, even before that, maybe Samuel wrote some things down. I don't know. But anyway, they're no longer following Wellhausen's dating system. The criticism now focuses on forms, the supposed oral tradition that preceded the documents. So now what they're trying to figure out, they're saying, okay, so these documents, the Old Testament documents, they rest, it's not just the guy that wrote them down, but they rest on an oral tradition that was passed down from generation to generation. And this oral tradition comes in different forms. Some of them were songs, some of them were legends, some of them were whatever, okay? Civic documents describing the government of the day or whatever, okay? So they have all kinds of things. All right, so they focus on the forms that are behind the written documents. So they attempt to define the literary types that make up the various forms of the Old Testament. I've already mentioned a couple of them. They search for the setting in life, not the historical setting of the original document, but in history of Israel that would call forth that kind of document. So this is where they're saying, all right, when they're talking about the priestly element, and this is the result of the work of the priests, and the priests, when the Israelites were captured by the Babylonians, and then they came back, they wanted to revive the original old religion. And so they made up the priestly rituals so that they could unify Israel at that time. So the crisis was what was happening as they were coming back to the land. In a way, it's sort of like the revival of native religion in our era. There is in some of the reserves, I've met some of these guys who are shamans, and they're supposedly reviving the language of the native, what we call the First Nations, of the First Nations, and they're reviving supposedly their religion. Okay, now this stuff wasn't written down. Okay, their language in many cases has been almost virtually lost. So they are trying to recreate it from the traditions of the grandmothers and the grandfathers and the things that they said. Now, those are oral traditions, and now in this age when all of that's been lost, they feel a crisis and they want to put it back together to revive this thing they've lost. So that's what they're saying about these forms. They're saying there was a crisis in Israel which caused this story or this legend to be necessary. And so that's the issue. That's what we're talking about, the historical setting. Not the original historical setting of Moses crossing the Red Sea. That's just a story. Why did they tell that story? They told that story to justify something else at a later crisis in the history of Israel, you see? That's what we're saying. All right, the history of small literary units evolved into larger literary units. So you have a whole bunch of little oral traditions, and they sort of get collected together because they're part of that same theme, sort of like Greek mythology. Right? You've got all these little stories about Zeus and all these little stories about Athena, and they collect them together and they develop how shall we put it, as a harmonized picture of who Zeus and Athena are. Okay? And they say that's what they're doing in the Old Testament. And then number 4, consideration of how literary units changed and adapted during the oral period, because oral tradition is very fluid. One person tells the story one way, another person tells the same story a different way, and the third person, a grandson tells it another way, the way he remembered it. Okay? And so it doesn't stay static. Once something is written down, you then have an authorized source. By the way, this is one of the reasons that we can actually understand what people in the 1600s were saying, because the King James Bible became the dominant literary force in the English language. King James Bible and Shakespeare's plays. And it established English. English was, now of course, you read that and you say, well, that's not the way I talk. But it set English on a stable course for now 400 years. We can still understand somebody, even though they have a different vocabulary, different style, we can still understand them, if we work it out, from 400 years ago. Now you go back 400 years before that into Old English, or Middle English, I guess Old English is further than that. You would be hard-pressed to understand what they're saying. I've listened to people, again, my history podcast, they'll read something in Middle English. You can't make head or tail out of it until they translate it into modern English. So, oral history changes, and so they're analyzing all this and saying, oh, this is how it all came about. All right. And then consideration of how the redactors modified the material over time. So the redactors have their own agenda, and they're taking that oral history, they're mixing it all together, and then they finally write it down, and they're creating the document that resulted. Okay, so this is form criticism. And this is where the modern critics are. Right? You don't need to know this. Let's just I'm just going to quickly go through the last. I'm running over time. And, anyway, we've got to get to lunch. Okay. I sort of knew this would happen, but I don't want to leave this one last thing. Okay. So Christian evaluation. Notice I said a Christian evaluation. I do not accept people who teach the Bible as in a documentary the documentary theory or form criticism. I do not accept them as brothers. I do not think they're believers in the Lord Jesus Christ. They may say they're Christians. I don't believe it. Okay, so this is the Christian evaluation. Higher criticism tends to make its conclusion, that is, there is no supernatural revelation, the underlying premise. They make their conclusion the place they start from. So that's circular reasoning. And by the way, this list comes from Gleason Archer and his survey of the Old Testament introduction. And then number two, and I'm paraphrasing his list, but anyway, number two, higher criticism ignores contrary evidence from the Bible. So the P documents, for example, came after the exile, but P elements in the historical books, oh, well, that was inserted later. Okay, so you'll find things where there's the description, say in 2 Samuel or 1 Samuel, of some properly executed priestly element that you'll find referred to in Leviticus. Oh, well, somebody put that in later and made sure it matched up. You see? That's just circular. It's just faulty logic. Okay? Number three, higher criticism assumes the Hebrew writers were incapable of using more than one name for God, unlike the writers of other nations. So you'll find documents from other nations about their gods, and they sometimes have more than one name. Well, that's no problem for them. But if it was a Hebrew writing it, well, obviously he's got two different documents he's referring to. You see? So it's not logical. It's just fully unbelief. Number four, higher criticism treats pagan documents as more reliable than the Old Testament, despite the clear evidence of the accuracy and antiquity of the Old Testament documents. Okay, I got to hurry. Okay. Higher criticism assumes the Hebrew religion could only be the result of evolution, according to their theories, as mentioned earlier. Number six, whenever a text can be claimed to have a discrepancy, no reconciling explanation is to be accepted. That's what Archer says. So they'll say, you got the so-called two accounts of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. Many people have spent many hours writing a very rational, careful explanation of how there is no discrepancy. and there is a way to show there is no discrepancy. Oh, that doesn't matter, okay? We're not interested in solutions, we're just interested in differences. That's the way higher criticism works, okay? And number 7, other ancient documents show the same variety of styles, repetition, etc., yet only the Hebrew Old Testament is subject to theories of multiple sources. That's really damning, in my opinion. And then last, higher criticism assumes that scholars thousands of years after the fact have more insight into dates, history, and contents than the original authors themselves. And that's the amazing thing. It is incredibly arrogant that the critics approach the Bible this way. Okay, so I have done a lot of talking. We are way over time. I will give you a chance. Anybody wants to ask a question or say something? Yes, Kenneth.
Yeah, my question here is that the Christian evaluation has given us the submission of everything,
Yes.
telling us that these critics are carnally minded
Yeah.
and do not have the Spirit of God.
Right.
You know, because the Bible tells us that God is Spirit.
That's right.
You know, so all they are concerned about is the physical outlook.
That's exactly right. They're materialists. That's right. That's exactly it. So that they have come to that view that it's all that matters is what they can see and touch with their eyes and hands, right? But of course, then they're making stuff up in their heads too. Yeah, it's really amazing. All right, any other comments or questions? Okay, everybody's afraid to make them because we're late. Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time. It's been a difficult topic. It's a hard one to absorb all this material. Lord, I pray that it is something that as we are aware of it, we know that there are people who hate God and criticize the Bible. And yet, in spite of that, we have good answers, and we can show that the Bible is true. So we do pray that you will help us to have that faith and walk with you, believing God's word. In Jesus' name, amen.